Here we go. Let's start the new unit, the emergence of a democratic state in South Africa. And we'll start off with 5.2. So not exactly the first part of the book, but it's the chronological part, and I want to stay in order. So why did these changes happen when they did? So let's kind of cover where we left off with the 70s and on into the 80s. And then moving back here, we'll be more familiar with de Klerk and understand this cartoon a little bit better by the end of this, as far as why he's trying to save apartheid, but also negotiate. So ANC and the armed struggle. The ANC with the MK, intensified the armed struggle with continued guerrilla attacks on very high-profile targets inside the country. So in the 1980, throughout the 1980s. In 1980, they hit a oil refinery at Sasolburg, and so here's this oil refinery on fire. 1981, they hit the Koeberg nuclear power station outside Cape Town. 1983, they hit the Air Force headquarters in Pretoria. And I think this is the attack on Pretoria down here with the cars on fire. And then 1984, they hit the naval dockyard at Durban. So they're hitting some pretty big attacks, as well as some smaller attacks every few years or so, such as the attacks on the power lines here. By the mid-80s, the MK had units and support structures throughout the country, so they really got a lot stronger and were ready for this continued resistance, continued fight for quite a while. They're also attacking police stations and other targets besides these high-profile targets. Plus, they also have support from what's called frontline states, other African states that are recently independent and support the ANC and the MK. And so they're getting support they're getting money, but these countries also will allow the MK guys to go out and use these countries for trading bases. And so, or they'd send their people over there to live in exile. And so they have these kind of supporting states all around them. And so Angola, they'll have bases there. Mozambique, they'll have bases right across the border in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and in Zambia. And so they've got quite a bit of support over here. But the South African military, or South African Defense Force, is not too happy about this, so they attempt to halt the MK, but really didn't work out for the South African Defense Force. This consisted of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and it's very much a modern military. It's a bit smaller compared to a lot of the others that they're fighting, but most definitely a well-equipped modern military. And so on some occasions they would go into these neighboring states, these frontline states, try to attack any of the MK bases that were near the borders. Plus they would go out and specifically assassinate any opposition leaders in exile. So if some of the ANC or MK leaders were hiding out in these countries or across the planet, they'd send out assassins to take them out. Other reasons as far as why eventually apartheid had to end is that South Africa just became, over time, increasingly isolated, and less all their allies were abandoning them, and nobody wanted to buy from them, their economy, their military. They were alone by the end of the 80s. Nobody wanted to work with them, and they needed a change. And so this is largely in part due to the international anti-apartheid movement, so it's just protesters that really have gathered up over the course of 50 years. And so they call for all sporting events to be boycotted. So that means no sports, no Olympics. They called for academic institutions, so no visiting professors from those countries. Cultural boycotts, so no music is allowed to go in or out from South Africa, as well as economic sanctions. You shouldn't buy things that are supporting or from South Africa. And this starts really in 1961 when they become their own country and officially are withdrawn from the British Commonwealth. They are kicked out of the Olympics in 1962, so they don't get to go to the Tokyo Olympics. All the way up until 1990, they're not allowed in the Olympics. They finally get to go back into the Barcelona Olympics. They're also expelled from the International Labour Organization in 1964. This is part of the United Nations that kind of looks at labor, and as far as they kind of figure out the rights of workers and watches over that. And they were kicked out of that organization because they labeled this entire system as using forced labor as kind of a light form of slavery. They were suspended, and they were almost kicked out completely, but they were not expelled from the General Assembly session of the United Nations. So from 1974 all the way until 1994, they were allowed to be there, but they just couldn't vote. And so here's some of the examples of some of the protest signs and buttons people started to have around the world to boycott and increase sanctions to force the government to change. Going back to the South African Defense Force, or the South African military, and as you can see, this is a modern military. They got modern jet fighters, modern tanks, and it's still not going to be enough. They were involved in the Angolan Civil War. So in Angola, they had a civil war to defend the South African occupation of Namibia. Namibia was right on the border of South Africa, and they most definitely wanted to keep it as kind of an occupied state. And so as you can see in this map, Angola has a civil war, and South Africa had been partially occupying Namibia, and so they felt this was a threat, so they sent in their army to defend in Angola. And they failed. Their military was defeated in Angola by Cuban forces in 1988 at Coito Cuanavale. And the difficulty of this battle, it shows the weakness of their military, in that this is a pretty good modern military force, but they're pretty small, and it doesn't work out against a larger, less experienced guerrilla military force. So even though the Cuban army didn't have the resources and they're smaller, they still beat the South African army with more money, but they were just a little bit bigger. And so in the end, they accept a UN settlement deal that gives independence to Namibia, so they have to kind of get rid of that country in 1990. And so they start to realize that their military is not quite what they thought it was, and that they're not ready to take on a guerrilla war. With collapse of communism, this is one of the main factors as far as why everything changes. So collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where all the communist nations fall. They quickly change their government starting in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So one by one, these communist nations decide, let's go with democracy instead. And it's a largely bloodless revolution, largely, not in all cases though. The government could no longer, because communism had fallen. Really, there were only two countries left that was giving money to South Africa to help defend against communism, and that was the United Kingdom and the US. Continued to support this apartheid government because they basically saw South Africa as their only ally against the spread of communism in Africa, and so they wanted to hold on there. But now that communism is no longer a threat, they figure, why do we have to keep supporting them? And so they were really reluctant to implement economic sanctions. They didn't want to hurt their economy because they wanted a strong anti-communist ally. Despite massive protests, most people voting and pushing to put on these sanctions, these two nations wanted to keep on that fight against communism by holding on to these allies, even if they were doing horrible things like apartheid. So we have Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan really looking at the fight of communism as something that's just more important than fighting apartheid in this case. For a long time, the National Party was worried that the ANC was just controlled by the communists, but now that the communists were weaker, the National Party wasn't quite as worried anymore, and maybe they could negotiate. So the NP is going to get a little weaker, but the ANC gets weaker too, in that most of the money to support the MK, most of the money to have this fight was lost, because a lot of the money is coming from Russia and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. And so they had to shut down a lot of their MK bases in Angola, were closed as part of the deal, but a lot of their bases across the country, a lot of the money is now out. And so we can kind of see this Russian support here for Mandela. And so both sides are now more willing to negotiate this to end the fight. The economy had been struggling and had been in a financial crisis since 1985. By 1985, all overseas banks decided, yeah, we're done with you guys. They canceled their loans, they canceled all deals they had, and the South African currency, the rand, collapses when all of a sudden all the other countries decide, we don't want to talk to you, we're not going to do business with you. Plus, more and more countries decide to support economic sanctions, to support boycotts, and divestment, meaning kind of removing your investment, removing your companies from the US, European, and Commonwealth nations. So more and more countries decide, we're going to shut down our factory. We don't want to deal with you. The big move, especially more than anything else, is the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. This is when Congress passes a law to ban all new investments and loans with South Africa. Ronald Reagan was not very happy about this. He vetoed the original bill, and Congress had to override that veto with a majority vote. And so this means no new investments, and all loans with South Africa must end, and South African Airways planes are not allowed to land on U.S. airports, so no flights from South Africa, no business with South Africa. And the U.S. was one of the big supporters, so this really hits them. Across U.S. American universities, this caused a lot of protest, and these caused these universities to sell off their investments in companies that had any South African connections. And so once people started to protest saying, hey, we should cut off anybody that makes a deal with them, all of a sudden these U.S. companies also backed off. And so 2/3 of U.S. companies with investments in South Africa shut down or sold off their operations there. And so IBM Computers, Coca-Cola, Kodak, General Motors, Mobil, and General Electric all had factories in South Africa. They had to shut them down because all of a sudden people stopped buying their stuff to protest. And so without anybody investing anymore, and the high cost of trying to keep up, they need a change, and it's just way too expensive to keep your military defending apartheid when nobody's buying your stuff. And then the protests got bigger. The government was unable to stop the sustained long protests of township residents, of students, of workers, and many others. And so the United Democratic Front was formed in 1983 to oppose the new constitution. We'll talk about that in another video. And they really become a leading role in the protests, culminating in a nationwide defiance campaign made by the MDM in 1989. We'll get into more specifics on those later. Other leading organizations include the COSATU, the South African Council of Churches, and the National Education Crisis Committee. But the UDF, the United Democratic Front, and kind of this group of people pushing for democracy, lead the way. In the townships, they were revolting in various ways. So here's some examples of township protests. And this included rent boycotts, where people just don't pay their rent. Nationwide stayaways, kind of a sit-home strike. Boycotts of local elections, consumer boycotts of products made in factories where workers were underpaid. And so the townships start to flex their own muscle and say, we're not going to stand for this. They even start to form their own little groups, their civic organizations, to act as pressure groups on the authorities to improve services in the townships. So it's almost like renters and town unions against the government. And they even do this at the street and area level and start to push more and more people power. Education was disrupted throughout this era as students started to just stop going to school, demanding liberation before education. Another leader was the churches. Opposition from church leaders played an important part, especially a Church of England Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Very outspoken critic. He's going to be a leader in the negotiations and kind of the path afterwards. So here is Desmond Tutu in the 80s. But a leader of fighting apartheid policies and supporting economic sanctions. So by 1989, it's time for change. With all this violence and economic downfall, it's time for something different. So both sides realize a military solution is not going to work. Shooting your way out of this, killing your way out of this, not going to work. It hasn't worked so far. So it's time to negotiate a political solution. The government didn't stop the MK terrorist attacks. The liberation movements didn't stop the government. And so National Party members saw the need for a change. F.W. de Klerk, right here, becomes president in 1989, and he is more open to reform. He is open to changes. And so originally he thought that he could control these negotiations so that at least the National Party would still be in power. He realized change was needed, and he figured the ANC was much weaker. With all their people arrested after 30 years of hiding, they'd be pretty weak in these negotiations, and he could find a pretty good deal to keep something of apartheid, or at least something of the National Party in power, something of white domination to continue. Mandela had been negotiating secretly without public knowledge for years. He was moved from the pretty harsh prison at Robben Island to a mainland prison in 1982. Secret talks with the government start in 85. He's moved to a much nicer prison. He's moved to a house inside of a prison outside Cape Town in 1989. He holds secret meetings with President Botha in 89 and de Klerk in 1990 before he's finally released for these further negotiations. So he had already started to talk out. Originally, the government offered to release him if he renounced violence as a political weapon, but he said, no conditions, no deals. I walk out without any conditions, and nothing's going to be left off the table. If we have to use violence, we'll do it. There were other meetings between ANC leaders in exile with white business leaders in Lusaka, Zambia, and prominent Afrikaners in Dakar, Senegal. So they were doing all these little secret meetings left and right, getting ready for the big negotiation. And finally, in 1989, the ANC agrees and confirmed its conditional support for negotiations with the government in the Harare Declaration. So it's kind of that first step. They're ready to talk. And in the next video, we'll talk about that negotiation, how that worked out or didn't work out. And so this is kind of a talk on why all of a sudden these changes happened. There we go.